Hello. In this section, I want to talk about organisational culture. In the previous video clip, I concentrated on talking about organisational structure and stressed the way in which theories and ideas about organisational structure from Weber and Taylor were enormously important in helping people reimagine what organisations could be and developing the large-scale formal organisation. Now, these ideas were massively influential throughout the 20th century. But by the 1960s or 1970s, many academics, management consultants and managers themselves were beginning to perceive that the rise of the large-scale bureaucratic organisation was also causing certain kinds of problems. These were problems of which Weber was aware too. Weber, when he was writing about bureaucracy in the early years of the 20th century, was very worried about the kind of dehumanising aspects of the bureaucratic organisation, the ways in which bureaucracies would make people into robots, into creatures who inhabited organisational structures and simply carried out the rules and tasks which were prescribed for them within those structures. So by, let's say, something like the mid-1970s, an increasing number of writers were starting to think about alternative ways of imagining what organisations might be. And the term that became, I suppose, dominant during that period was the idea of culture. Now, culture is originally a term, I suppose, primarily from social anthropology, a way of describing the habits, the rules, the attitudes, the opinions of a particular group of people. But it concentrates primarily on the ideas that people have. The term culture is a term that is almost in opposition to the notion of structure, because essentially what the term culture is trying to point to are the kind of informal attitudes that we have to other people, to money, to kinship, to technology, and so on. Probably the most important writers, or actually whether they're the most important or not, it's a moot point, but certainly one of the most influential writers on this, were two American management consultants, Tom Peters and Robert Waterman, who wrote a book called In Search of Excellence. In Search of Excellence is in some sense the first modern management guru book. It sold millions of copies and was translated into tens of different languages. What Peters and Waterman argued was essentially that the day of organisational structure was past, and that a new era of organising was just about to happen, and their book was intended to help it happen, in which managers concentrated on managing culture rather than worrying too much about structure. One of the rather nice terms that they used was to suggest that bureaucratic organisations of the past were suffering from a kind of analysis paralysis. In other words, that people were so busy worrying about the details of various forms of financial reporting, making sure that the forms had been filled in correctly, that the 5-year strategy plan had been written and was being adhered to, and so on, that they no longer, or rather, no, put it a different way, that they'd lost sight of the original reason why the organisation had been founded. What the book In Search of Excellence demonstrated, or claimed to have demonstrated, was that the really successful American firms in the late 1970s were firms that did attend to cultural management, that these were firms that were careful with the ways in which they thought about managing the people within the organisation, and were less concerned with the kind of structural control aspects of the organisation itself. A couple of themes we could pick up from that. One of them is that Peters and Waterman place an enormous emphasis, as do lots of subsequent writers, on the various rituals and ceremonies and stories and songs that are employed within the organisation in order that people feel some sense of commitment and community to that organisation. For example, if we look at the IBM company song, this is an example from a book by Deal and Kennedy, two authors who were writing at roughly the same time. The IBM company song was intended to be a song sung by various salespeople in order that they expressed the values of IBM. And as we can see, these are generally positive values. If you like, this is like singing the national anthem of your country. But at a corporate level, it's supposed to capture the hearts, the minds, the spirits of the individuals who are working for the organisation. A further influence on these kinds of ideas was the rise of Japanese organisations. Remember that in most of Western Europe, in the 1970s, the rise of Japan to become a major industrial power was a massive shock. Suddenly, a nation that had been utterly defeated in a world war 30 years previously was now challenging many of the large American and North European companies for dominance in various strategic areas. And the story that was often told about Japanese organisations was that these were organisations where levels of commitment and care provided by the workers were enormous compared to their Western counterparts. So Pease and Waterman were in some senses trying to recapture what they saw as massive levels of commitment in the Japanese workforce and use that as a way of encouraging American organisations to think about management in the same sorts of ways. Pease and Waterman were by no means the only people who were writing about these kinds of issues. In the following couple of years, mainly through the 1980s, the idea of organisational culture became a real guru fad. A gigantic number of books were written and lots of consultants made lots and lots of money by claiming to be able to help managers think about managing the culture of their organisation. And part of this talk was also reliant on the idea of demonising the bureaucratic organisation that existed previously. In other words, for culture to be attractive to managers and consultants and academics, in the sense it had to be argued that culture was better than the emphasis on organisational structure that preceded it. An very interesting example of that for me is the rise of things like mission and vision statements. In many nations in the world, it almost became obligatory for large organisations, both private and public sector, to start to construct themselves mission or vision statements. Now, these were kind of sets of rules, a bit like the factory rules I referred to in the video clip on structure. But they're sets of rules that emphasise feelings rather than penalties or particular places and times and spaces where people should be working. They're rules which suggest various things about employee commitment, about their attitude towards customers, about what the business wants, and so on. These sorts of mission and vision statements, in many cases, became quite crucial for the organisation as a way of understanding itself, as a way of articulating what its beliefs and goals and values were supposed to be. However, one of the odd things about organisational mission statements is that though they claimed very often to be resting on some idea of organisational culture, in practice many of the employees who worked for the organisations where these mission statements were written didn't seem to be that impressed with the mission statements themselves. Quite often, in fact, those employees found the mission statements to be quite misrepresentative of the sorts of organisations they were working for. Now, I think this is a very good example of the ways in which an unquestioning assumption about any particular management fad can often be very, very dangerous. Ideas about organisational culture are undoubtedly important, and in the next video clip I'll talk a little more about that and explain why I think they're so important. However, it is also the case that if managers believe that employees are simple, naive souls who can have the wool pulled over their eyes by things like mission statements, they will almost inevitably produce highly negative effects. Many workers are very aware of their organisations. They understand the ways their organisations operate. And for managers to think that they can easily control the behaviour, beliefs and attitudes of those employees is probably a very naive misreading of the complexity of human beings. So to summarise then, ideas about culture popularised in the second half of the century were massively important in beginning to understand a balance between culture and structure in organisational analysis. However, too much of an emphasis on culture clearly created certain kinds of problems for managers and for employees, just as too much of an emphasis on structure had created the kind of robotic organisations that Weber had feared. So in the next video clip, we'll look at how structure and culture might be balanced in the modern organisation.